And now that we're into this new marketing environment, we had discussions at our Grains and Oilseeds Policy Committee about potentially having some meetings about how to market wheat and barley and the kinds of contracts that would be available in this new open market. The province had run some meetings, and certainly the grain companies and the wheat board have had rounds of meetings about their products and so on. But we felt it was an opportunity for us to provide more information about what's available. And so we again partnered with the University of Saskatchewan and developed a project that has been funded by the CARDS program through the Agriculture Council of Saskatchewan, and we're very grateful for their support here. And Dr. Frayne Olson is going to be presenting about a bit more general background issues, but also specifically about contracts. And moving forward on that, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Frayne Olson specializes in crop marketing and risk management at North Dakota State University with collaborative work in agribusiness management and farm management. In 2007, he completed his PhD in agricultural economics at the University of Missouri, and then worked in the Department of Economics at Iowa State University until August 2008, where he conducted outreach programs for marketing and farm supply cooperatives and agricultural producers. Dr. Olson has farmed for many years in eastern North Dakota, and we're delighted to have an expert in grain marketing for wheat and barley and for contracts in particular. Please welcome Dr. Frayne Olson.
All right, we set up. Good afternoon. Beautiful day. You guys were kind enough to roll out the nice, beautiful weather for me too. That was very kind of you. I appreciate that. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about crop marketing, and in particular about contracts, contract design, some of the key things that we see going on in the States in particular. And I think I'm of the view, and I think a lot of people in the marketing world are of the view that as the Canadian system moves away from essential desk selling, that many of the things that we see in the States are starting to be developing in the Canadian system as well. I don't know that we'll ever become exactly the same, because I don't think that was the intent, and there are obviously some very good structural differences between the US system and the Canadian system, but I think we're going to look a lot more similar than we have in the past. And so what I want to do today, talk a little bit about what's happening in the States, some of the typical contract provisions that we have here in the US, and in particular, if there's a few of you that decide you're going to jump in your semi and go south of the border and start marketing grain down there, we have a little bit different system of grading and standards than you do up here. And so I think you also have to understand what you might be confronted as you go across the border, okay? And in particular, again, I'm not going to talk about border crossing issues, but more importantly when you're dealing with the elevator itself. Because I don't know that they've worked all those details out, and I'm not the expert in that area. So I don't want to go into something I shouldn't. So with that, my objective today, and actually the last one should be the first one. It's really to answer your questions. I have some material that I'm going to go through to try and stimulate some discussion, but the most important thing is to answer your questions as we move forward. So if you think of something as we're going on, jump in. I'll be happy to try and answer it. If something comes up at the end, we'll definitely have time to do that. So I want to provide just a brief overview of the U.S. marketing system. And there are some subtle differences that you have to recognize, in particular for spring wheat, durum, and barley, which is really what I'm going to focus on today. And I do want to specifically talk about the quality grades and standards that we have in the States for those three crops. I also want to just briefly introduce you to some of the different marketing alternatives for those crops that are based off of futures contracts or have futures contracts trading backing them up. Because there are some really unique and creative things that have come out of the system as part of that. The first thing I want to start with is just to give you a snapshot of what's going on in the US and the relative size of the crops that we have there. When we look at planted acreage in the US, this is what we're looking at. Corn is by far the dominant. Now this is last year's planted acreage. Okay? Corn is by far the dominant crop. Number 2 is soybean. Number 3 is wheat. Now when I talk about wheat, I'm talking all wheat. And a minute I'll show you some other stuff. Then we go to cotton, sorghum, and barley. Notice how tiny barley is. And in the States, we have technically 6 classes of wheat. We typically talk about 5 of them. I'm going to mention them really quickly. We have hard red winter wheat, which again primarily is grown in the southern plains, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. Kansas is the big winter wheat state. Okay? We have hard red spring wheat, which is primarily North Dakota, Montana, and Minnesota. Then we have soft red winter wheat. Soft red winter wheat is used for making cookies and crackers, things that you don't have to have a lot of yeast content to, where it's a pretty flat product. That's primarily grown in southern Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, up into Michigan. It's more of an eastern U.S. phenomena, primarily in the core corn and soybean growing regions. Then we have white wheat, which is out in the Pacific Northwest primarily, and white wheat is actually subdivided into 2 different classes. That's why we get 6. And a little tiny one on the very top is durum. Okay? Now, if you were to look at all wheat, just lump wheat as wheat, and lump it together, and look at the bushels we produce, and again, going back to wheat only, oh, let me back up, I'm getting ahead of myself. Of these crops, of the major crops we have, a handful of them have futures contracts backing them. Corn obviously does out of Chicago Board of Trade, CBOT. Same market also trades soybean futures. And anybody that's doing anything in canola understands the linkage between canola as an oilseed and soybeans as an oilseed and how closely tied they are, right? When CBOT soybeans go up, canola goes up too. We have 3 different contracts that are traded for wheat though. And you've got to understand some of the differences. We've got Kansas City Board of Trade, which is the hard red winter wheat. Again, that's traded out of Kansas City. The Minneapolis Grain Exchange is the spring wheat, which would be very comparable to your spring wheat up here. And then the Chicago contract is actually this soft red winter wheat. Some people think that that's a feed wheat market. Technically, that's not correct. Now, of all the wheat classes, we tend to feed more of the soft red winter wheats than other classes. But soft red winter wheat is a milling wheat. So the contracts that are traded on the Chicago Board of Trade is milling quality wheat. It's just a different class. Let's look at bushels now. If we were to put this and count bushels instead of acres, this is what it looks like. That's one of the reasons in the U.S. we spend so much darn time talking about corn. For 2 main reasons. Number 1, that's one of our biggest crops, obviously. But number 2 is, right now, we are the tightest on corn of any of our major commodities. Supply-demand situation in corn is paper thin. And again, to put this in a little bit better context, and why some of the changes have gone on more recently in agriculture and in the futures market in particular, that's how much corn we use in the ethanol industry. About 5 billion bushels. Again, to put that in perspective, if you take all the soybeans produced in the U.S. plus all the wheat produced in the U.S. and add them together, it's about 5 billion bushels. So the ag complex, and in particular the futures market now, is very closely linked to what's happening in energy. When crude oil prices go up, typically corn goes up, which pulls everything else up. So the connections and interactions between these markets are becoming a bit more complex than they have in the past. So how does U.S. wheat production compare to Canadian wheat production? Very crude rules of thumb, general guidelines. If you were to look wheat as wheat, the U.S. produces about twice as much wheat as Canada does, bushel-wise, okay? Approximately. Now if you look just at spring wheat only, Canada produces about 1.5 times the spring wheat bushels that we do in the States. Okay, so for spring wheat only, you're about 50% bigger. In durum, for the durum bushels, you're about 1.6 to twice the size of the U.S. durum crop. So you're much heavier in the hard wheats and the spring wheats, okay? So what does all this mean? Contracting in the U.S., contracting either before you're producing it or after it's produced and it's in the bin, is a very, very common practice. And common for both what I call large market crops like corn, soybeans, wheat, but also small market crops like, in North Dakota, canola, which is really a very small market crop relative to you guys. Sunflower, dry edible beans, field pea, lentil, We've got a lot of oats. I mean, we only have a few oats acres in the States. I consider those to be small market crops, again, relative to the corn side. But contracting covers the full spectrum. Okay? But you've got to understand the contracts between the large market crops like corn, soybeans are very different from the small market crops like field pea and lentil. Okay? There's a lot of similarities, but there's some very, very important differences. So I'm going to talk about some of those differences. We need to get some interaction going here. I don't really want you guys to just sit back and smile and be very polite. You guys got to say something as well. So why do farmers, and more importantly, why do the buyers contract? Why do we even have these things in place?
Risk management.
Risk management, security. Okay, from a farmer standpoint, what's the risk management and security things you're looking for?
Price guarantee, delivery.
Okay, if you want to try and lock in a price. You want to make sure that you have a delivery point for it. You've got somebody in line that's going to take it. Anything else?
A date.
Pardon?
A date.
And a date. Yep, so you know exactly when it's going to be delivered. I mean, at harvest is obviously a very nice time to have that stuff delivered, right? So why would a buyer do it? If you're the buyer of grain, put yourself on the other side of the desk. Why would you want to offer contracts?
Security supply.
Security of supply, absolutely. Because 9 times out of 10, what's happened is you've got buyers on the other end that are waiting to get that grain. Okay, and if you've got sales on this side, you need to match it up with production on this side, right? That's what the grain merchandise, that's what the elevators do. That's their job. What else? What's another reason they would want a contract?
Volume.
Volume, to make sure that it goes through my facility and somebody else's facility, because I make it on handle, right? The more bushels I handle, the better off I am. So I want you to contract with me, not somebody else.
Lock in price.
To lock in a price, absolutely. They're after the same kind of thing. Now what they're hoping is that the prices go up instead of down, and you're hoping the prices go down instead of up, because if you locked it in, that's where you're at, right? You buy low, sell high. That's what everybody's trying to do. Okay.
But don't they have to...
Freight and logistics. That's a fantastic one, because that's one of the challenges that the grain merchandising system really has, is the flow of grain. You've got to make sure when you sign a contract with the buyer, an end user, they want that grain delivered on time at their location, right? Well, if you're trying to fill a unit train and it comes up a little short, what do? You got a problem. So the translation is, there's a whole long list. We could go on all day talking about some of this stuff, and I don't want to get bogged down in the detail of it. But from both the buyer and seller standpoint, we want to lock in a price. And one of the things is, in particular, as we've seen, at least in the States, corn and soybean prices explode. Some of these smaller market crops are also trying to say, we're going to offer contracts, because we don't have a futures market to use as a pricing mechanism. We're going to offer contracts to say, we are going to be competitive with corn and beans. We will offer prices where you can make as much profit, if not more, than growing beans and corn, okay? Because we don't want too many of those acres disappearing. The other thing that we're seeing is that we want to make sure that the correct crop is growing. And one of the things you're going to find out in the wheat industry in particular is the buyers are getting very, very sophisticated in what they're asking for. They don't want generic spring wheat. In fact, they don't even want wheat that's graded based off of Canadian grain standards or USDA grade standards. They're nice, they're a good reference point, but I want grain that looks like this. And I'm willing to pay a premium if you can deliver this, not that, because that isn't as useful to me as these specific grading standards. So there's more and more of the end users that are saying, these are the grade characteristics that I'm looking for. And if you have a system in place that can deliver that to me, I'll pay you a premium for it. Okay, so it's not, a lot of the grains being traded now in the U.S. is not necessarily off of standardized USDA grading. It's off of buyer specifications. So it's a matter of communicating information through the marketing system to say, well, it's not only just about price, it's what am I buying? Or what are you willing and able to deliver for us? Okay. Why do we even study this? And I'm going to get a little bit academic for a couple slides here, but I will eventually get back into reality. Don't trust me on this one, please. Why do we even consider this, or why do we study this? And one of the things, that challenges I ran up against in the U.S. is we have become so accustomed to contracting that I get a little bit concerned that we're getting complacent. All right? Understand there's obviously differences in contracts and contract design by commodity. Okay, so the pea and lentil contracts are very different from the canola contracts, right? We already know that. There's also obviously differences between companies that are dealing with the same commodity. So if you're going to contract, I know at least in North Dakota, if you contract for field pea with company A versus field pea with company B, they're looking for something different. They have different contract provisions because they have different marketing outlets. One of them may be mainly domestic based, one of them may be internationally based. Okay? The other thing is, even if you've been dealing with one company over and over and over again for several years, their contract provisions change continually. And I'll give you a recent example. Because contracts are never what we call you can never have a complete contract. You can't write a contract that covers everything, every possible inevitable thing, right? First, you can't think of everything, but even if you could, you'd have some of the contract about 6 feet deep and nobody ever will sign it in the first place. You never read it, right? Everybody wants a simple one-page contract. Well, those are tough to come by because sometimes there's some things that happen that we need to cover. And I'll give you an example. In 2011, at least in North Dakota, we had a lot of prevented plant, which means it's a crop insurance term. Basically, there's a whole bunch of acres that just never got planted. It was just too wet and cruddy, and by the time the fields finally dried out in August, it was a little late to replant the crop. So they just never got planted. Well, farmers in the middle of the winter, before all this happened, had signed contracts for the delivery of pea and lentil and canola and a whole bunch of crops. Now what do? I will guarantee you in 2012, every company that's doing business in North Dakota has reevaluated their contract provisions dealing with prevented plant. And what do we do if we have another spring like that? So they do change and update and modify on a yearly basis. What really concerns me the most is farmers see the price up here and they say, oh man, that's a great price, I want to lock that thing in. And then they sign on the bottom line and walk away and say life is going to be all fat and happy. And they don't look and read the provisions of it and say, okay, now, what do I have to do to get that price? Because that's what the rest of the contract says. So if there's nothing else you remember from this presentation, please remember when you go home and you're working on this stuff, study the contract provisions, ask a lot of questions. Because I will guarantee you the guy on the other side of the desk that's trying to work with you on this doesn't want to have problems and conflicts later on either. And they're more than happy to sit down and explain things to you. And that goes whether you're a Canadian company or a US company. Okay, so just don't be scared to ask questions and study the terms and conditions. The last thing, and this is the last real academic slide I got. Understand there's this big continuum of contracts. And in the US, we kind of have these marketing contracts on one end of the continuum and production contracts on the other end. So a marketing contract is really, it's a purchase agreement. Now, we talk about establishing price, quality characteristics, quantity characteristics, but you as a producer have a lot of flexibility in how you grow that crop. What they're really worried about is the end product. I don't care how you get there as long as you deliver what I'm looking for. Okay? These are typically signed or available for crops that have already been produced. Not always, but typically. And a lot of times they're ones that have futures markets backing them. So they'll be for the corns, the spring wheats, the soybeans, the canolas. Okay, those kinds of contracts. And the fact we have futures markets allow us to do a lot of creative things in how we handle things. Because the futures market allows you to separate. You can deliver and price later, or you can price it now and deliver later. We can separate these things out. The other end of the continuum, way on the other end of the spectrum, and there's a whole bunch in between, is production contracts. Again, we're concerned about establishing price, we're concerned about quantities, we're concerned about qualities, but the buyer usually has their special provisions. Saying, for example, I'm going to pick on malt barley for a little bit. You can't raise any variety. I want you to grow one of these 3 varieties, because these are the varieties that I use in my malting process to make my beer taste different from the next guy's. Or in the case of organic production, you have to be a certified organic grower to be able to sign a contract for organic production. Or in the US, at least in my particular area in eastern North Dakota, we have a lot of food-grade soybean products. For food-grade soybeans, there are some very specific requirements you have to go through when growing it to be able to make those certifications. So in this case, the buyer, the end user, is coming in and saying, you know, I'll sign a contract for you to produce it this way. Not only this crop, but produce it this way. And again, typically you have to do that when? Before you decide to plant it. So a lot of these are pre-plant kind of contracts. Very typical in the small market crops. Those things that don't have futures market. So understand that's kind of the spectrum. We have everything in between there. So let's talk about quality. Quality in the US. We're going to start with spring wheat. The pricing system in the US is a little bit different, especially for spring wheat. So here's what commonly happens. When I'm a farmer, I mean, if you search the web and look on the internet and look at the pricing quotes from elevators in North Dakota or Montana, everybody can do that, right? It's all public information. How do they do that? They start with the futures price for hard red spring wheat, and they subtract out a basis. And the basis is, mathematically, it's just your local the difference between your local cash price and the futures price. And that basis changes a little bit over time. And I'll show you some graphs in a little while. But it also changes from point to point. So the basis, for example, in Minot for spring wheat is going to be very different than it is here in town. Why? Because you're looking at different points. There's a lot of things that go into that. So you take the futures price minus the basis, and then we talk about the premiums and discounts after that. So we're really looking at a base price. So rather than having, what did you say, there was like 72 different grades, pricing grades under the old wheat board? Yep, I don't know what the complete list is, but it's phenomenal.
I think it was 93 or something.
Okay. The point is, in the US, we start with the futures price, subtract the basis, and then we go up and down from there to figure out where our grades are. We end up in essentially the same point. The prices aren't really drastically different, but the process we use to get there is very different. Okay? Again, I just want to point out that the futures market does allow both the buyers as well as you as potential sellers a lot of flexibility in how you do this. And again, towards the end of the presentation, I'll talk a bit more about that. So let's talk about some specific grades. And all of this stuff I got off of different elevator websites. So most of the stuff I have right here are USDA grades, but if there's contract-specific things, I try and include that. And then also, when you look at these pricing, these different discounts that I'm going to talk about, those can change over time. So all I did was I went to a couple elevators and say, what's typical today? This fall, they can be very, very different. And I'll explain why that's possibly different. Okay? Test weight, we start at 60 as our base, so when you go in and dump your truck, they weigh it, divide by 60 pounds to get your bushels. They really don't start discounting on quality until you get below 58 pounds. So there's a little bit of leeway in there. And anything below that, then they start taking some cents off. FM or foreign matter, again, not usually a big deal. It's typically anything that isn't wheat. Now, it's not dockage like weed seeds. This is stones and other miscellaneous stuff. Again, very common in there. Damaged kernels will be like heat damage. If you pull it out of a bin and you got some spoilage, or if you've got some sprouts starting to show through, sprout damage is in that category. Falling numbers. I want to take just a minute to talk about falling numbers. Anybody heard of that before? A couple handfuls here and there. Yep. Everybody understand how that works? Falling numbers, if you were to look at the USDA grading standards, falling numbers is nowhere on that chart. That does not distinguish number 1 from number 2 in any way, shape, or form. This is an industry-based quality standard. This appeared a few years ago when we started having a lot of wet, rainy, cruddy falls. So what is falling numbers a test of? Pardon? The dough strength. Really what they're after is dough strength, but it's in a farmer language, it's looking at kind of pre-sprouting. So if you have what the millers are looking at is saying, you know what? If you have a really wet, rainy fall, you can have damage to that kernel or start the sprouting process without actually having a green tip go through the green shoot coming through the tip of the seed, right? So chemically, what happens? 2 things important in the sprouting process. You take the carbohydrates and the proteins, and there's some enzymes that start breaking those apart. Because as part of that, that's the sprouting process. It takes the result of that breaking down and making the leaf. And the roots. Well, what are the two main things that millers are after, grain milling companies and bread manufacturers are after out of wheat? Carbohydrates and the protein. So if you've got chemistry that's starting to break that stuff down, it makes really poor, lousy dough. So this is a test they've developed, and it's actually a driveway test, so some of the large elevators in the state have the equipment to test for this. The magic number is 300. And that's actually 300 seconds. And if you want the details of it, I'll explain it later. But if it's 300 seconds or better, it's golden. You're fine. If you've had some rainy, wet falls or had a bunch of fog, that number, if it falls below 300 for the first units, and again, these aren't very bad discounts, they'll take it, but they're going to start discounting because the flour isn't going to be worth as much. So let me ask another question. These are actually very, very small, almost nothing. We've had falling numbers discounts that are much, much greater than that. So why do these discounts change all the time? Again, this is just as of last week.
Probably depends how much of that quality you get in the system.
You are exactly right. So let me ask a question to you guys. Think this through. You're an elevator manager. What happens if they have a little bit of poor quality stuff and a whole bunch of really good quality stuff? What do you do? Well, very little discount, and you blend it off, right? We do that all the time. In fact, part of the, again, merchandising system is designed to blend for consistency. So the first rail car out of 110 unit is the same as the last car. Now what do you do if you've got a whole bunch of really poor stuff and a little bit of good stuff? I won't repeat that. You got some serious trouble. So if you're an elevator manager, what do you do? If you're an elevator manager, what do you do? I asked that question at a farmer meeting in North Dakota a couple of weeks ago, and there's a guy, an elevator manager in the back room, he said, or back row, he said, cry. Right? Now you got a problem. Now you get,
You don't want to mix.
the last thing you want, that's right, the last thing you want to do is mix it out, because all of a sudden you're going to take a little bit of good stuff you have and turn it into junk. So what do? You find two separate markets for it. And I had a crusty old elevator manager tell me once, he said, you know what? Selling high quality products, in particular wheat, is very, very easy to do. Everybody wants it. They're willing to pay for high quality stuff. What separates the men from the boys in the grain industry is how do you deal with the poor quality stuff. That'll either make you a hero or a bum in a hurry. Okay? So what ends up happening is you have to go through two separate markets. You've got to find somebody that's willing to use this low quality stuff. Now there's always markets for the lower quality wheats, and each user is a little bit different in what they're looking for. But guess what? They normally only buy so much, right? Well, if everybody and their brother, all the elevators in the area have the same problem, what happens to those particular markets that can use low quality stuff? They get flooded. So they start discounting even further. So we can take these discounts of 5 cents per tenth. Everybody saying, well, 5 cents a bushel, I can live with that. You take that and change it to 15 cents, and instead of every 10 points under 300, well, now all of a sudden you're delivering stuff that's 250. 250 falling numbers. So you take, let's see, 5 times 15 cents, now you're talking about some serious money. Yes, sir?
Falling numbers is essentially measuring the density of the person.
Correct. That is the simplest explanation for it, yes. 30 seconds. What they do is they take a sample, grind it up into a flour, they add some water to it to soak it up, they heat it, and then they put it in this tube, and they take a rod, they dump the rod in there and say, how long does it take for that rod to fall and stop before it stops? 300 seconds is the magic number. If it's good quality stuff, you get a real pasty, almost like a Play-Doh kind of stuff, right? If it's got a falling numbers problem, if it's sprouts have sprout damage or the chemistry has already started to change, you get something that looks more like a lotion. And that rod will just drop right to the bottom. Okay, so if it's thick and doughy, that you can get 600 falling seconds, 600 seconds before it stops. Well, that's pretty good stuff. Now, if you get a 200 number, that thing's moving through there pretty quickly.
So they're actually doing that at the elevator driveway?
Yes, there are some of the larger elevators will do that. Some of the smaller elevators will take a sample and send it into a lab and have it done there. Now for falling numbers tests, typically that's not done on every load. Okay, so you bring in, let's say, a field or a lot, a bin, and they'll take a sample off, they'll grade it for protein and for moisture and test weight and all that kind of stuff, write it down on your ticket. They'll save a little bit into a main sample. They'll take, once you're done with that particular lot, whether it be a field or a bin or whatever, say, well, I'm done hauling that, I'm going to switch to something else. They'll seal that thing up, take the sample, put it into a lab, and get the falling numbers test. Or they'll do it in-house. Once they're done with that sample, they'll bring it in. They're not going to do it, they're not going to waste time, especially in the middle of harvest, testing every load. Okay? And I'll guarantee you right now, if it was a nice, beautiful fall like you had last year, where there was basically no rain during harvest, they're not even going to test for it, because they know all of them are going to come in big numbers. But if you had a fall where, let's say you had, some of the crop came off in really good shape, and all of a sudden a rainy spell, where you had a long stretch of foggy weather, they're going to start testing for it to say, do we have a problem yet? And if it gets to be a big problem, then they're going to start discounting much harder. Okay? Question, yes?
This might be kind of a silly one, but like, so in the States, we're selling, you know, like your hard red spring and your hard red winter wheat.
Yep.
Like, is it basically the market is milling, or is like up here where if you get that off-grid stuff, the feedlots or the ethanol's going to take it, or is corn so dominant in that they don't even look at it?
Well, feed wheat we have a problem getting rid of, and typically it gets shipped up here because you guys use feed wheat. I mean, corn, even barley, almost about right now about 80% of the barley grown in the States is for malt. We don't have a feed market left. If it's really low-grade stuff, we put it in a train and ship it up here to the feedlots in Alberta because everybody's using corn. Guys have forgotten how to feed barley. Corn is so dominant. So everything, we're all shooting for milling. We're all shooting for the flour market or for the either international or domestic. And understand, there's a few international buyers that are willing to take some lower quality stuff. You know, Egypt is an example. Egypt is a very price-sensitive buyer. They're not so concerned about quality. They just want a really cheap price. They'll try and make bread out of almost anything. Now, the Japanese, on the other hand, are just the opposite. They're very quality buyers. If you don't have grade A golden stuff, they're not interested. You've got to negotiate on price. They're still concerned about price, but well, you better have the quality or you're not even in the game. Okay. So there, we do have some. I got to be a little careful. We do some of the poultry industry, especially in the southeast, will use feed wheat because they can flip very fast. It's not like a ruminant where it takes a while to switch from corn to wheat. The poultry guys will switch in a heartbeat if the prices are there. So we do have some outlets, but in North Dakota, you guys are closer. It's as simple as that. Vomitoxin, Don, you guys know all about that, right? Kind of, sort of? Anybody had like tombstone, fusarium head blade? You had that stuff before, right? Vomitoxin is basically it's a fungus that grows on the kernels that have scab on them, or head blade. What it does is, they call it vomitoxin because if you feed it to animals with high concentrations, they'll really literally get sick. Now, what happens in the milling industry? It's not that you're going to get sick eating bread that was made from a vomitoxin, because that's not the case. What it does is, it kills the yeast. So what happens if you're making bread and the yeast starts to die? You get some really flat, sticky, ugly looking bread, right? So again, it's not that you're going to get sick from it, it's just that it makes really poor bread. Bread quality just dumps in a hurry. So the magic number here is 2 parts per million. If it's less than that, you're fine. Okay? At about 2 parts per million, they'll start to discount. At 5 parts per million, they can't use it. Now think about that, 5 parts per million. You're testing a pretty small quantity in there. It doesn't take much of this stuff, and suddenly you're in feed grade.
So are they doing FDK counts, or are they actually testing for presence of the toxin?
It depends. If this gets to be a really big problem, they're testing for the toxin. Yep. You know, again, if you've got a little bit of it, you blend it off, and nobody has
Well, I'm just
questions.
asking because in western Saskatchewan, you'll get the FDK, but you won't get the ammonia because of the actual
Correct.
variety of the
Right.
of the feed.
I mean, what they're really after and concerned about, because You know, most of the, when we had the big problem with Tombstone in the 90s, most of the elevators put in gravity tables, so they're able to clean it out. At least do a pretty good job of getting the actual damaged kernel out. But there's still the presence and possibility of the vomitoxin. So just because you have fusarium head blight doesn't mean you got vom problems. But you gotta have fusarium head blight to have vom problems. And therein lies the problem. But they are literally, so most of the time the damaged kernels will be damaged kernels. The other thing I want to mention really quick, these things are cumulative. Which means if you have light test weight, then the light test weight is caused by some sprout damage. You'll get docked for light test weight and you'll get docked for sprout damage. So you add each of them together. Okay. Moisture, and I guess I didn't realize, I thought the moisture contents would be more common. In the US, 13.5 is the standard. That's kind of the base. If you get above 13.5, you got to start drying. The other thing that happens is not only is there drying charges at the elevator, but they also take off shrink. They're not going to pay you for water. Okay? And those shrink charges are typically larger than you would have if you were to put it in your own bin. And the main reason for that is the elevators are using very high temperature dryers. They're handling it a bunch of times. They do get some additional breakage and some additional dockage issues because it's dried at high temperature. They're handling it pretty rough. So they want to make sure that they don't get taken on that deal either. So if you got a lot of high moisture grain, typically you're better off trying to do it at home if you have the capacity. Proteins. So let's talk about proteins. This is where I have a few more slides. And I know somebody's got to keep track of me on time here, and I'll try and pick up the pace a bit. Our base is 14%. Now, if you look at the contracts, the futures contract out of the Minneapolis Grain Exchange, it says 13.5. That's the base for the futures contract. There's still a lot of domestic buyers that are looking for 13.5 protein wheat. But when you sell it into, at least into most elevators in the United States, they're going to say 14 is the base. If you got better than 14, we're going to give you a premium. If you have less than 14, we're going to start discounting. Okay? They use NIR machines just like you do here. So they're using the same tester. But understand those premiums and discounts, just like we talked about earlier, change over time. I'm going to show you some graphs in just a minute. Also understand that the export market, 14 is it. If it goes through an export channel, that's what it is when it hits the boat. The domestic market, there are some millers, some buyers who want 14 or better. Some are saying, well, we'll take 13, 13.5, because depending on what you're going to use it for, it really makes a difference. So if you're making plain old pan bread, just bread, loaf of bread that you buy in the store, you can do fine with winter wheat only. You don't need any spring wheat. Yeah, a little spring wheat in, you get a better loaf, but you don't have to have it. Now if you're making pizza dough, or if you're making bagels, or if you're making frozen dough products, you have to have spring wheat. And you have to have high protein spring wheat to get that dough strength. Okay, to get the gluten strength you need to make. Think about a pizza. You know those guys that are flipping the pizza around, right? If you don't have good gluten strength, you get a bunch of tears and holes and stuff. You can't make good pizza dough. So the domestic millers are looking for something different. Really what it does is it depends upon your final use. So end users, depending upon what they're doing, are looking for different things. But when you deliver to the elevator, they start with 14 and they go up or down from there. Okay, so what's driving the protein spread? So let me show you a chart. I would really love to have a chart like this that looked at protein differentials at local elevators. And I know they're out there, and I've talked to a couple and they say they'd be willing to share. The problem is they're in a 3-ring binder stuck in the back of the shed with about 3 inches of dust on them, and I don't have time to go through and re-enter all the numbers. Okay? Fortunately, for me anyway, USDA keeps track of the prices for different qualities of wheat, for different proteins of wheat, delivered to major terminal elevators. They do this on a daily basis. So all I did was I downloaded all that information, daily information, I started doing the math on it. Okay, so this is for Portland, Oregon, which is really a terminal market for export, like your Vancouver. Okay, so this is almost all export. The middle line right there going through is 14 Pro, so that's our base. The blue line on top is the premium that you get for 15% protein. The green line on the bottom is this discount for 13% protein. Okay? What do you see right here? What story can I tell from this graph?
Quality issues.
Quality issues. They change, don't they?
Yeah.
There's a bunch of years in here where there's really no premium or discount.
Everybody had good stuff.
Everybody had good stuff. Bingo. And then there's a couple of years, like this one, and more in particular the last couple of years, where all of a sudden they went completely berserk. They went absolutely nuts. And I tell you, I had my phone was ringing off the hook there for a while in a few of these years saying, what in the thunder is going on with this protein stuff? We went through a whole bunch of years here where there was really no differential. And now all of a sudden, I'm getting discounted like crazy because I don't have the protein. What's going on?
How come you have a space there?
A space where?
Uh,
Oh, right here?
Yep.
Right in there. Why? Because there was no prices quoted. That literally there was no bids for 13 or 15. Said if you can't deliver 14 Pro, we're not interested in anything else. That's literally what happened. Okay, so let's look at the same information then on a marketing year basis. So instead of just, this is from June 99 through last Friday. If you do it on a marketing year basis, you get a little different story. And this is an ugly chart, so let me clean up just a little bit. Let's take out some of the old numbers. So this is from 2008 on. So 2008, 9, 10, and 11. Look what happens. Now, our marketing year for wheat starts from a pricing standpoint, June 1. Why June 1?
Winter wheat's coming off.
Bingo. Winter wheat is starting to be harvested. You get down into southern parts of Texas and they're harvesting in May. About the time they're planting. I mean, think about the harvest run. When do the custom harvesters go south? Okay. So in 2008, we came along, there's almost no discount for 13, and all of a sudden, boom, we jumped down and there's about a 75-cent discount. It bounced around for a while, and also we come to 2009, we're about 60 under, and all of a sudden, boom, it goes to $1.40 under. Recovered a little bit, and then we come across here, and we got some sagging going on here. Now all of a sudden, 2011, we're way down here, and then all of a sudden it pops back up. What's going on right about that time period? What's happening in late August, first part of September?
Harvest.
The hard red spring wheat.
Spring wheat harvest, absolutely. So what's the market doing? They're trying to figure out how much high quality 14 or higher wheat is out in the country. And if we got a whole bunch of it, what's going to happen to the protein spreads? They go down to almost nothing. If you don't have enough of it, what happens? They pop back out. If you look at the premiums, again, this is really ugly, it's identical. They're mirror images of each other, essentially. What one goes up, the other goes down. They open and close together.
I'd say amount.
Not quite. So let's look at that. So we were at about $1.40, $1.60 back here. Let me go back a couple slides. We're about $1.80 here.
More discount.
There's more discount than premium, and that's typical. At least in Portland. At least in Portland. I'll show you in Minneapolis in just a minute. Okay, here's why. So every fall, the wheat growers commissions, so the North Dakota Wheat Commission, the Montana Grain Growers, the Minnesota Wheat Growers, as well as the U.S. Wheat Associates, pay for a survey, a sampling, and they test the quality of the winter wheat harvest. I mean, the spring wheat harvest. Well, they do winter wheat too, but. This is a very typical protein profile for a spring wheat. Anywhere from 35 to 45% of the crop, 35 to 45% of the samples that came in, tested 15 Pro or better. Very common. 2008 was, again, very similar, kind of a typical year. Now, all of a sudden, we get into what? 2009. That's when we got that, all of a sudden, that first big drop. Okay, and then we get to 2010. We got a further drop. Why? Because we're short 2 years in a row. Then we come to 2011. Pops back up again. What happens to our protein spreads? They disappeared. Supply and demand works, right? Okay. And what happened in 2009 and 10? I don't know about here, up here, but we had a fantastic year. Cool summer. Test weights were horrendous. I mean, we had 62, 63 pound wheat, very common. Bushels were off the charts. We had big yields. What happened to protein? Very low protein. Then 2010 11 comes and we had pretty lousy yields. We had a lot of heat right at flowering and during seed fill, right? And what happened to our proteins? We got a lot of thin kernels. Proteins went nuts. Now, unfortunately, there's no good way that you can hedge or do anything about these protein scales. That's just something you're going to have to learn to live with. The point I'm bringing this stuff up is my suspicion is, my sense is they're a lot more volatile in the States than they have been up here. I don't think some of the wheat board's activities was going to average and smooth some of that stuff out. The Minneapolis market's a little bit different. Okay, I'm going to show you, go through this real quick now that you know what to look for. Minneapolis tends to be a blend, primarily domestic buyers, but some export market. And the export market tends to go east instead of west. Okay, the Asian Pacific country buys a lot of the really high protein, high quality wheats, in particular Japan, Korea, Philippines. You get into the eastern markets, you get into, for example, North Africa, Egypt, that's a little bit different. They're looking, okay? So here's the spreads for Minneapolis. What do you see here that's different? I know I'm going to run over time. I hope that's okay. What do you see different here? There's some similarities, right? The open and close together. Let's look at right here. What happened here? The premiums are much bigger than the discounts, aren't they? Why might that be? They're short of high protein. So where did I say all the high protein was grown? Western North Dakota, eastern Montana. These guys are in Minneapolis. They got to work a lot harder to get that grain pulled from Montana all the way back to Minneapolis versus getting on a unit train and shipping out to Portland, right? Plus, a lot of the buyers in the Minneapolis market, 14 is nice, but they're willing to deal with 13.5. They're not as hypersensitive getting this really high protein stuff. Some buyers are. I want to be very specific. Some buyers are because they're making the pizza doughs. Others that are doing just plain old bread, they'd like to have spring wheat to help boost the quality, but they don't absolutely need it.
So,
Yes, sir.
backtracking a little, that chart you had with where you said 35 to 40% 14 protein, that was Portland?
No, that was, so this one right here. These, I want to be very specific about that. I glassed over it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
There's the Wheat Commission, the Growers Associations for wheat in the States, collects samples every fall from the elevators. And they do the testing for wheat quality. And they do not only from the farmer's perspective saying, what are you buying, but also then they do milling and baking characteristics. So that when they do their promotion activities, especially international stuff, they say, well, here's what the crop looks like this year, and here's how it's going to help you doing a better job milling and baking or doing whatever product you do. So this is the percent of, and they take 350 to 400 samples a year. So that's the percent of the samples that came in that tested 15 plus protein, 14 to 15, 13 to 14, and on down.
What I'm wondering, to get the whole picture, don't you need to look at the zillions of bushels of wheat grown, winter wheat grown in Kansas that are lower protein?
Yes, so they do the same testing, the exact same testing for the winter wheat crop, and for the hard red winter wheat crop, as well as the soft red winter wheat crop, as well as the white wheat crop, as well as the durum crop. Okay? And they're not doing it just only on protein. They're doing it on test weight, they're doing it on falling numbers, they're doing it on all the basic quality standards, as well as the phenograph tests for the dough and a whole bunch of other stuff for the processors to understand the quality. Yes?
But those are largely segregated markets in the United States.
Well, there are separate classes. So if you take spring wheat and try and sell it as winter wheat, or more importantly, because there's a price discount, you never do that. But if you try to take winter wheat and sell it as spring wheat, ooh, don't ever try to do that.
So you need to know the protein profile for the current crop by class.
By class. In fact, they actually have these broken down by different growing regions within the state. So like the state of North Dakota is broken down into, I believe, 8 different groups. And so they literally have this information for each of those different regions within North Dakota. Because there are some buyers that prefer to buy from certain areas. Okay, but that was a good question. So Minneapolis, it looks very similar but a bit different, a bit more choppy, right? And the premiums and discounts are different because it's a different market. So if you've got an elevator, to come back to this, your question now, If you've got an elevator that ships primarily through Minneapolis or is working directly with a domestic miller, their protein premiums and discounts may be very different from a guy that's doing a shuttle train out to Portland. So, and each of these, they could be the same company. You know, the same company could have two different elevators, one of them shipping east, one shipping west. So you do have to check around. Durham. Guys interested in Durham? I figured so. You get the general feel of what I'm doing here? Okay, I'll speed through this a little bit for the sake of time. Test weight, 60 pounds. Discounts start right away. Durham and malt barley are the most quality sensitive crops we grow. If I ever get a question about quality, it's either Durham or malt barley. Everything else is kind of, and then you get on the other end where, like corn. Nobody's worried about corn quality. FMAM moisture is 13 is the most common moisture content. There's some that prefer 12, especially if it's going to go directly into a semolina plant. They like it a little bit drier. Protein contents, 13.2 is the most common. There's a few buyers, especially international buyers, that would prefer 13.5. But the protein discounts for Durham are not like they are for spring wheat. Protein is not the core thing we're looking for in Durham. Typically, there's no discounts until you get below 12. But again, it depends upon the buyer. It depends upon the outlet. So sometimes there are some that will start at about 12.5 and they'll start discounting below. So it does vary a little bit depending upon who's using this stuff. Falling numbers is 300 is the base. Some will require 350. Or they'll start discounting below 350. Okay? So it really does make a difference. And this stuff, if you notice, it was 5 cents for spring wheat, it's 25 cents for Durham. Yeah, these guys take a hit. You have any kind of rain on your Durham crop, and boy, you're going to get hit pretty good. Vomitoxin, and again, the vom tests are identical. Chemistry is identical, but look at the discounts here. The discounts for wheat were bad enough. They were, again, right now about 5 cents. Again, this is as of last week. The vom tests for Durham are much steeper. Now they'll go a little deeper in 5 was the cutoff for spring wheat, 6 is the cutoff for Durham. But again, they're hammering you pretty hard by the time you get down there to 6. Again, this will vary depending upon the year. I'm not saying the numbers that I'm putting up here are cast in stone, because they are not. They do change. Hard vitreous kernels. Here's a weird thing about the U.S. system. They have their own little lingo and slang that they like to use. So it's a little bit harder to get a handle on what are they doing. So if you're going to be delivering wheat, Durham to a U.S. buyer, be very specific about asking about these hard vitreous kernel counts. Some of them, if you look at their websites, they'll say, well, choice is priced at, or high-end milling and low-end milling. What do they mean by that? And these are kind of general guidelines, but you got to ask specifically. Usually the top grade stuff is 88% or better hard vitreous kernels. 85 is kind of the more normal, the more industry standard. US #1 Durham, hard amber Durham, is 75. So if you were to look at USDA grades, you'd say, as long as I'm above 75, I'm golden. Not when it comes to the market. 85 is kind of the more norm for high-end Durham. And there's a few of them, few buyers that only want 88 or better. That's some pretty high-quality primo stuff. Now, they're going to pay for it. But if you don't have that, you can get discounted pretty quickly. Damaged kernels, again, same kind of thing. Is it sprout damage? Is it heat damage? Is it some spoilage? Whatever. You've got to be a bit careful about that. Malt barley. Anybody interested in malt barley? If not, I'll skip over that. Okay, last set of slides. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit. We don't have a futures market for Durham. Well, it's not in the States. Now there's one on the ice exchange out of Winnipeg. They're trying to get it started. And I'm hoping and praying that it gets going, because if it does, it would make the Durham issues a lot easier. There'd be a lot of flexibility. Right now, it's very, very difficult to get good prices on Durham. Spring wheat is the one that I want to talk the most about. I want to talk about basis. And I know you guys are somewhat familiar with basis because of canola, right? You got basis contracts for canola, right? Well, this is for spring wheat. I just want to show what's happened. We have a very seasonal pattern for basis in spring wheat in the States. The red line right here is the price, the cash price for spring wheat in central North Dakota. Actually, an elevator out of Minot, big elevator out of Minot. These funny multicolored lines in here are the different prices for the futures contracts out of Minneapolis. The different contract months. Again, just like canola, you got different contract months, right? So look at the pattern, the general pattern here. Yes, cash prices and futures prices tend to move together. They go up together, they tend to come down together, but not perfectly, right? They don't always move the same exact amount, do they? That's called basis. What is basis? Mathematically, it's simply, again, the local cash price at your elevator versus the futures price. So it's going to vary from location to location. What are some of the things that would cause that to vary? Why is there this difference between a futures price and a cash price? Part of it is timing. A futures market is a contract for delivery in the future. And we're looking at like a September futures contract, right? Well, what's the price going to be in September? Well, if I want to deliver, you know, I get this time issue, right? I got location issues, transportation. So the basis in Minot is going to be very different than the basis here. Why? Because we're talking about different logistical systems. We're talking about different distances we have to travel. So the basis in Fargo is going to be the difference in the basis in Williston. Why? Because we're at different locations and our transportation thing is different. Quality. This is really, really important. The futures market doesn't deal with quality issues. Quality is standardized. When they're trading contracts in the futures market, these are standardized contracts. The only thing that's negotiable is price. Risk, obviously risk influences things. If we're in very, very volatile markets, that spread can be very different. Competition, that impacts the local market. So if you're fortunate enough, for example, to have a canola crush plant located right by a local elevator, what do you think is going to happen to prices? Be a bit more competitive, right? Because you've got two competing uses. You've got the crusher right there versus the elevator. It's probably going to ship it. They may ship it overseas. Okay, different markets, different uses. The last one, which is really the important one that more recently we've seen, we've got different participants. The guys in the cash market are buyers and sellers of cash grain. Who buys and sells futures contracts?
Hedge funds.
Hedge funds. The elevators use it, the processors use it. There's a lot of farmers that will use their futures market directly, but we got the hedge funds going on in the futures market. They don't deal in the cash market. So there's some times where the hedge funds decide to come in and they can drive the price up or drive the price down, and the futures and the cash market doesn't adjust as rapidly. So even though they move together, we could have a great big run up in the futures price and the cash price lags behind, right? So we get this spreading going on. So if you were to take this chart real quick, and I know I'm already over time, and just chart the difference between these two, just chart the difference between this, that's what it looks like. So the basis, the spread, tends to be widest when? When is the biggest difference? Harvest. Exactly. Why is that? Harvest pressure. Yeah, everybody's delivering grain. Cash market doesn't have to work very hard to get grain to flow, does it? And the futures market's saying, well, you know, we're worried about what's happening in the future. And then it peaks out here, and again, this is an extreme case. This is really an extreme numbers, but this actually happened. These are real numbers from North Dakota. It peaks out when? Well, usually this is a spike. Usually it peaks out about May. What's happening in May?
There's no grain out there.
Everybody's busy in the field. Who the heck wants to haul grain? I mean, I'm worried about getting the field work done, right? The cash market's got to work a lot harder to get grain to flow. And we have this nice seasonal pattern. Now this is the point. We've got a negative 140, that's $1.40 per bushel, to a positive 160. The cash price actually went above the futures. How much of it? Quick mental math. How much is that? $3 a bushel. Now, depending upon how you market your crop, you can either gain a big chunk of that or you can leave that on the table. And that's just because of the spread between the cash and the futures market. If I could get you half of that, would you be interested? $1.50 a bushel? If you do the right job of marketing, you can capture a big chunk of that. What it does is there's now become a big premium, at least in North Dakota, for on-farm storage. Part of the reason you capture this is storing it. Okay? Again, you can price it now and deliver it later. or deliver it now and price it later. I'm going to have to cut the end of this off, so I'll just talk about this chart. This is, after this slide, I'm done. This is a cheat sheet. I know I'm a teacher, I'm supposed to be, you know, making you guys take tests and all that kind of good stuff. But I love cheat sheets. I'm getting old enough, my memory isn't as good as it used to be. This was originally put together by Dr. John Ferris, or Jake Ferris, out of Michigan State University. He started this back in the 1980s. He's kind of tweaked it and evolved it over time. I think this is a fantastic tool. Because what it does is it tells you, given what you think is going to happen in the marketplace, what tools, what contracting things do we have in our toolbox that we can use to get the most out of the market. Okay? So if you think the futures price is going to go up, you look at one of these two quadrants. If you think futures price is going to go down, you look at one of these two quadrants. Okay? If you think the basis is going to strengthen, meaning that the differential between these two are going to get smaller, you look at the left-hand side. If you think the difference between the cash and the futures is going to spread out, get wider, you look at the right-hand side. Kind of cool, huh? Let me go through, let me look at this one. Here's your basis contract. So under what market environments does a basis contract work the best? Well, it works the best if you think the futures is going to go up and the basis will weaken. Because what are you doing? You're locking in the basis right here, the spread. You lock the spread in, and then what happens? You wait for the futures market to do this hedge fund thing. Hedge funds are coming into the market, the futures price takes off, but the cash price lags behind. If you lock in the basis first, you wait for that futures market to take off, about the time it's topping, you say, okay, now I want to lock in the futures part of that. Essentially what we've done is we've taken the futures minus the basis you locked in, and you got a much higher cash price. Does a basis contract work back over here? Not very good, because you're locking in this really wide margin. And as the futures market comes up, you to subtract that big margin, you're actually getting worse off. Basis contracts don't work really good over here, but they work fantastic over here. And I have a thing that I do that takes about a day to go through all of this and let you work the math out and see how it works. And it's actually a very, very nice thing. Now, I'm going to share a copy of a PDF version of this that you can download and print out. It's a one-page cheat sheet. You can just take it home and look at it and think about it and study it. You should be able to figure it out. It's not rocket science. But I really, really, really like this tool because it helps explain a lot of stuff. And with that, I better be quiet because they're going to take the big club and start beating me pretty quick.